Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us this evening for this very interesting discussion. I'm wanting to mention that we're on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people this evening, and many, many thanks to Gowling for hosting us this evening. Very timely discussion, and we're delighted to be part of it. We have Jan, who has joined us from Washington and has been visiting throughout the city today. Many thanks for Laurie Turnbull for stepping in at the last minute, as our moderator had laryngitis, and so there was lots of different last-minute changes today, but delighted to have so many of you here. This evening's discussion will be recorded and put on YouTube tomorrow, so if you do not want to be filmed or photographed, you can let Nashi know on your way out, and we'll ensure that you are not. Aside from that, thank you for coming out this evening. A pleasure to just hand things over to Scott Burke, who will welcome you to Gowling.
It's actually Todd Burke. But, you know, whenever anybody makes a mistake, it's always Scott Burke, so I don't know. There must be something about that. I want to welcome you all to the offices of Gowling WLG. And for those of you that don't know us, we are an international law firm with 1,400 lawyers, and we have 18 offices throughout the world. We are proud of our record around inclusion, diversity, and innovation, and to be able to host you here this evening. Your topic tonight aligns with our privacy and cybersecurity practice, which is led by Wendy Wagner. And unfortunately, she couldn't be here tonight. She's in Europe on business, so you're left with Scott Burke to deal with the situation. Our practice is a growing one in privacy and cybersecurity, dealing with all aspects of privacy, of data breaches, of compliance in all regards. So on behalf of the firm, welcome to our offices, and I hope that you enjoy your program this evening.
I was supposed to sit here, right? Yeah, okay. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to tell you a little bit, I'm going to start with a little bit of an introduction to our topic tonight. According to Brian Kloss and Nick Cheeseman, authors of How to Rig an Election, there are now more national-level elections in a year today than at any time before in human history. And yet, citizen trust in democratic processes is failing, in part because technology is making it easier and easier to interfere with or even rig an election, as the title of their book suggests. On the one hand, information technology is making it easier for political parties to identify prospective supporters and for politicians and voters to communicate directly with one another. Information technology, in principle, should also increase the transparency of political and electoral processes. But technology is just a tool that can also be used in ways that support or undermine democratic institutions. In 2013, election watchers in, I don't know if I know how to pronounce that.
Azerbaijan.
Thank you. Azerbaijan were able to download an app to watch returns as the votes were counted. Imagine the surprise that users felt when the app was able to report the final results a full day before voting day. But the new risks arising from information technology, including social media, aren't limited to weak or emerging democracies. As we learned in the 2016 US presidential election, cells of Russian hackers were able to infiltrate the servers of the Democratic Party for months undetected. They were able to disseminate fake news stories that research has now told us voters are primed to read and share more frequently than accurate stories from mainstream media. Russian hackers were even able to mimic US citizens and organize offline events and rallies that hundreds of real American voters showed up for. The Communications Security Establishment is the federal agency charged with protecting computer networks that are critical to Canada and gathering foreign signals intelligence. In a recent report, and they don't issue many, the agency warned that hacktivist groups are very likely to use cyber strategies to attempt to influence the 2019 federal election. However, more than paper-based voting activities, the agency stated that it is political parties, politicians, and the media that are vulnerable to cyber threats. To help us understand the nature and extent of those threats and what Canada can do to respond, we have a panel of experts. I will be inviting each panelist individually to start the discussion before turning to questions for the panel as a whole, and finally, questions from you on the floor. First, I really want to pronounce this name perfectly. Jan Neutze?
Very good.
No, okay, so like very good or not quite?
No, very good.
Okay, I'll take it. His career to date is focused entirely on issues around security. Prior to joining Microsoft in 2011, Jan worked at the United Nations, first in the Secretary General's Executive Office, leading a range of cybercrime and counterterrorism projects, and then as a program officer with the Counterterrorism Task Force. The program works globally with stakeholders in democratic countries to protect campaigns from hacking, increase political advertising transparency, explore technological solutions, and defend against disinformation campaigns. Jan currently wears two hats at Microsoft headquarters in Redmond, Washington. In addition to his democracy-focused work, he also maintains the role of Director of Cybersecurity Policy. Jan, thank you so much for being here. In April, Microsoft publicly announced the launch of the multi-pronged Defending Democracy project. What are the various elements of the project, and why is Canada on your radar?
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction. It's great to be here with all of you this afternoon. And thank you also, of course, to the Public Policy Forum for pulling this together. I think it's a very timely topic and opportunity for us to really come together very much in sort of a cross-sectoral, public-private partnership kind of a way, which I think we'll probably talk about quite a bit this evening. Let me maybe just outline at a high level, why Microsoft is engaging on these topics, and then put a few ideas on the table in terms of how we might collaborate also, as I said, both between public and private sector, but also between different countries on these topics. And I think that's particularly topical given that Canada is currently chairing the G7 group and holds the presidency there. From our perspective, so our Defending Democracy program, which I have the great pleasure of leading, is about 2 months old. So we're sort of the new kid on the block, and at sort of a high level, the different sets of activities that we are looking to engage in really break down into 4 components, and so those relate to election integrity issues, and so this is everything from trying to help secure the voting infrastructure and the process that goes into voting. Think about what some technological solutions might be in that context and what best practices look like. Second, very important to us is trying to help keep political parties and campaigns more secure. I think what we've all seen in the 2016 elections in the US, but not just in the US, also in many other places around the world, looking at what happened in Europe with the Macron campaign in France, as well as the hack of the German Bundestag, sort of clearly demonstrate that there's a huge need, I think, to do more to keep political parties secure. But then also think about other aspects of this problem, which in many ways, in our mind at least, is a hybrid problem relating to both sort of the cyber-enabled aspects of things, meaning confidentiality, integrity, availability of data, but also sort of the information sphere, and I think that's clear to everyone following these topics, and that relates to the transparency of political advertising, especially online, and questions around how those regimes can be strengthened, but also, of course, the disinformation aspect of things, disinformation, junk news, some people call it fake news, and thinking about some technological solutions that might actually help in that regards. And to some degree, we're at the early stages of addressing things like deep fakes through artificial intelligence and other technologies. But just like the bad guys want to use technology to disrupt different democratic processes, we're determined to use technology to actually help defend against that. And so this is sort of how we're looking at what we might be able to contribute, and we're really doing so against the backdrop of cyber malicious activity that we've been seeing over the years, and in particular, and I want to be really clear about that, in particular the nation-state threat that goes into and takes place in cyberspace. We have a cyber threat intelligence center at Microsoft, and that is a group that tracks nation-state activity when it comes to malicious cyber activities. And without sort of going into too much detail, that group, I can just tell you, has unfortunately had to track an ever increasing number of what is generally referred to as advanced persistent threats, APTs, over the years. And not only is the number of actors growing, certainly their persistence is growing. They're not always the most sophisticated groups, but they are very persistent. And what they figured out is that they don't always have to go after sort of the most hardened, high-end targets, be it military or intelligence organizations. In fact, it's much easier to go after much softer targets, and so political processes, institutions, and stakeholders tend to be those softer targets. And to the extent that we can assist with that and assist with helping to secure those sort of at-risk communities is very much what we want to do, and that is very much part of our mission and our mandate. So looking forward to the discussion on these topics.
Thank you. So just so that I can clarify too, so in what you just said, political parties are an example of a target.
Oh, very much so. And I think it's important to look at, one of the lessons clearly from the 2016 elections in the US, but again, also from other countries, is that it's oftentimes not necessarily the candidates themselves, right? Yeah. Yes, that could happen, but it's of course the staff that's vulnerable. It's people in the broader sort of ecosystem around political campaigns. Sometimes it's people that may work in think tanks for a few years, and then they get recruited back into helping with a campaign or into government. And again, many of these organizations simply have not necessarily been thinking about defending themselves in this environment. And it's very hard if you're a small political operation, or if you're a think tank or a research organization or a university, to go toe-to-toe with a nation state that's coming after you to go after your data. And so I think this is where we as industry not only can help, but frankly have a responsibility to do more.
And so coincidentally, right now we have a bill before the House of Commons that's talking about political parties' handling of personal information. So that'll come up, I'm sure, in the conversation. Thank you very much. I'm going to introduce you more to the other members of our panel. Dr. Elizabeth Dubois examines the role of digital media in political communication. Her cutting-edge research considers the roles of automation and algorithms in how people learn about and participate in their political systems. Elizabeth is a graduate of the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford, where she completed a PhD in information, communication, and the social sciences, as well as an MSc in the social sciences of the Internet. Currently, Professor Dubois teaches graduate and undergraduate courses in political communication, research methods, quantitative methods at the University of Ottawa. And last but definitely not least, she is currently a fellow with the Public Policy Forum. Elizabeth, welcome. If I can ask you, what are the benefits and the risks, as you see them, to political discourse from all this data, all these IT tools, and especially the ability to engage directly on social media platforms?
Thanks. It's a really big question, right? All of this data, all of these IT tools, there's a lot of different kinds of data, a lot of different kinds of IT tools. So I'm going to start with social media platforms, probably the most kind of recognized and relatable for everyone in the room. When we're thinking about social media platforms, there's a whole lot of promise for potentially direct democracy, or if not that, at least this direct contact between governments and citizens, or politicians and citizens, and this opportunity to build community around ideas that are important and policies that matter to citizens, to understand better what they need and what they want. And this is wonderful for sure, but it's also flawed, and it's been flawed since the beginning. It's not just the new cyber threats we've been talking about recently, but from the beginning of using social media for political engagement, we've been systematically excluding people, right? People who aren't active on social media, perhaps because it's a personal choice, perhaps because they have issues with privacy, perhaps because they don't have a computer or a cell phone or access, right? There's a bunch of different reasons that people get excluded. And so when we start relying on that kind of interaction, we start to form this vision of what Canadians want and need, what public opinion is, that excludes people in a way that's completely unfair, and often a way that people don't understand, right? You understand when you've decided not to go to a march or not to go to a protest, right? You understand that you've made that decision. Choosing not to post about whether or not you think national park entry fees should be free is not a thing that you usually consider as a political decision, right? I just didn't want to tweet about that. And so we create this system where people aren't necessarily aware of the political message they're sending and not sending, right? We also have new threats that start to create a problem here. And that is when we're using social media to share political information or to infer ideas about what people think and care about, we are opening ourselves up to being gamed by players who want to game the system, right? There are algorithms that very importantly filter through the information and give us what is going to be most important to us. And each social media platform picks a different way of defining important. You know, some pick what is going to be the most likable or shareable. Some pick what has been upvoted or downvoted by the community of trusted moderators. A bunch of different ways it happens. But it's filtered and limited. And then what we end up seeing can be things that maybe a bot creator dedicated bot network to. So when I say bot, I'm talking about automated social media accounts that somebody has created to make them appear as if they are social actors, right? They've given them an identifiable personal entity on some platform. And so when we create this system where the really good things about using digital tools for politics require us to believe that these are actual people, and then we have an entire system that incentivizes people creating non-people to participate, we create this issue because we can't then trust the information that's coming from it in terms of how to set policy agendas. And that becomes even more critical when we start thinking about the kinds of get out the vote campaigns that might happen, or the kinds of campaigns that might sow political discord or create amplify rather existing tensions. And this is what we've seen in a lot of other elections, a lot of the fears about the role of political bots, whether they've been bought by Russians or somebody else, even somebody within Canada. A lot of the fear is it's going to exacerbate things that already push people away from participating in their democratic system. And so that form of voter suppression is very, very difficult for us to identify and then to regulate, but it's a very real problem that we are going to be facing in the next election and then beyond that. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to introduce you to Dr. Michael Powell. Michael is a recognized expert in the areas of law, law of democracy, comparative constitutional law, and election law. A frequent advisor to government on matters related to election law and constitutional law, he has also been asked to serve as an election commissioner and election boundary commissioner. An associate professor in the University of Ottawa's Common Law section and director of the faculty's Public Law group. He is working on projects related to voter suppression, election management bodies, election administration and democratic transitions, and democratic theory. He is also a fellow at the Mowat Centre for Policy Innovation in the School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Toronto. Welcome. Good to see you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
We know that Canada's electoral and democratic decision-making systems face new threats from cyber risks. Are these existential threats? And don't our policymakers face real challenges in responding to these threats in ways that continue to respect our democratic principles, such as charter rights, freedom of expression and association?
Another big question, and I have to remember what existential means. To me, the big lesson that I take from the last number of years is that democracy is fragile. And we have been taking democracy for granted. We take for granted that our elections will be clean, that they will be perceived by the public to be fair. We take for granted that the levers of control about how democracy works are local or domestic. They're things that we as Canadians can control. And we've assumed that democracy looks like the best alternative from amongst all the other options around the world. And I think none of those things look as certain in 2018 as they did in, say, 2010 or in 2000. So I disagree a little bit with the earlier, the quote to start off from Brian Klaas. It's not that democracy is newly fragile. It always has been, and there's always been dirty tricks, and there's always been attempts internally and externally to undermine it. The challenge is how to deal with the new technology. So one way of viewing the Elections Act is it's a series of different rules that were put into place to respond to all of the practices that political actors use that somehow made the system less fair, right? That made it harder for voters to keep their elected representatives accountable, or that somehow tilted the playing field in one direction or another. So I don't frame this as a new problem. It's just an old problem with new techniques, and so we need new responses. So I think there's the international part, there's the foreign nation-state interference component, there's also a domestic component. So one of the ways that we have to adapt is dealing with the fact that elections are open, right? It's not just Canadians and groups advertising on Canadian television broadcasters that are relevant now, right? Anybody with a Facebook account can potentially purchase advertising that reaches Canadians. So that's a very different model than a corporation or a union or an environmental group in Canada that wants to advertise to Canadians and has to take out an ad in the Globe and Mail or on CTV or something like that. So how do we deal with that openness in a way that doesn't frustrate the right to free political expression, but that also respects that it's Canadians who should have the say? We also have to adapt to the fact that our legal tools may not actually be effective. So if you are a foreign nation state and you're interested in undermining a country that may seem like a shining example of democracy and multiculturalism and openness, like Canada potentially, it's very hard to see that foreign nation state or the leaders of that nation state being held to account in a Canadian court and going to jail under, say, provisions for adhering to election rules and our criminal law. So it's hard to actually see the law being effective in the way that it potentially can be with domestic actors. I think we also have to face up to the fact that our control is less, right? So there's been a lot of discussion, especially in the US presidential election, about advertising on Facebook, right? Because the parties did it there, the parties do it here to a really large extent. Facebook treats political advertising essentially the same way it treats commercial advertising. So a lot of the discussions have followed from that basic fact. One of the ways you can advertise on Facebook is to micro-target, right? Which makes sense if you want to sell sneakers. Find the group of people who are most receptive to wanting to buy your product, right? And they have data that's very helpful in telling you that. You can also use that to sell a political message. And the problem is, unlike an ad on Hockey Night in Canada, it's impossible for the public to know whether ads are being targeted at certain groups, what the content is, and things like that. So Facebook's responded by taking the voluntary measure of having a registry of political ads. It's hard to see how something like that is satisfactory from the point of view of the Canadian public or the public interest, because that decision could be changed at any time. right? Or the algorithm used to target people could be changed at any time. I don't think Facebook would do so to try to interfere with the Canadian election, but they may change the algorithm for commercial reasons, and that may have a direct impact on which political parties can reach which voters. So there are a number of different ways in which the new environment challenges our understandings of how the law should work, which is mainly geared at political parties and third parties domestically, not foreign nation states, social media platforms, and other actors. So the last thing I'll say is we have a permanent campaign, right? It sounds almost naive to think there used to be a day where governments governed, and then when the writ was drawn up, then you started thinking about campaigning. But that used to be the model, how we understood politics work. Now it's 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. Social media has facilitated that. Our election laws, I often argue, campaign finance are the best in the world, probably. The most effective, at least up until recently, in creating a level playing field. So money doesn't dominate Canadian politics in the way it does in most other countries. But you can spend an unlimited amount before the official campaign period starts. Okay, and that's been a loophole that some of us have argued should be closed for a long time. That loophole looks even more problematic if it means foreign entities can be involved, say through Facebook advertising or other advertising. So the current bill, C-76, which I hope we'll talk about, takes some steps in dealing with that. But what I think, you asked about constitutional law, while respecting people's freedom of political expression, I think we need to be much more aggressive in imagining what the Constitution will permit us to do, because only by being more aggressive in our electoral regulations will we actually be able to preserve the level playing field that Canada's had for a number of years. So that means things like pre-writ spending limits. It means things like imposing rules on the social media platforms themselves to disclose information. And it means a whole host of other measures that are currently more intrusive than what we have on the books, but which I think are necessary in order to keep electoral integrity.
Thank you very much. Our fourth panel member, Scott Jones, is currently Assistant Deputy Minister of the Information Technology Security Program at the Communications Security Establishment, where he has worked in various capacities for over 20 years. The CSE's IT security program is responsible for providing cryptographic solutions aimed at protecting the Government of Canada's most sensitive information. His team also provides security advice and guidance on next-generation technology, building relationships with industry in an effort to increase security and actively defending against malicious cyber activity. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
We've heard about the need to manage vulnerabilities in the IT tools themselves, the ways that political parties and third parties are using new tools to meet political goals, and about the real tensions between protecting systems from cyber risks and at the same time upholding the very values of freedom that those electoral systems embody. Can you talk about how the government is responding, both in your proposed legislation and more broadly?
Well, I think I'll have to leave the proposed legislation because I'm clearly not Minister Katrina Gould.
I was reading that and I was like,
yeah,
did you propose legislation? That's so cool.
No, I think we probably need to leave
that.
that one for the minister to respond to.
We can all talk about that.
But, or somebody who's not a nonpartisan public servant feel free to jump in. But I think when you really look at the tool sets, it's really the fact that the job of a political party, or the job when we highlighted that political parties were one of the pieces that were the most vulnerable. Yep. IT is not their job. It's a tool that they use to facilitate their activity. And in a lot of cases, it's all about function, not necessarily about designing with security in mind. You're not talking about organizations that have millions of dollars to spend building a large IT organization. And so you do have to rely on organizations and companies that you can build into, but also you're relying on a volunteer base that typically brings its own technology, that you have to rapidly stand up 338, if not more, facilities suddenly, and you collect a tremendous amount of private data that used to be physically protected, and now we're putting it all online. And so the threat dynamic has just changed so rapidly, and the use of technology there. So that's something that frankly just has to be addressed. So we have the examples of social media that were extremely eloquently explained as we went through here, through the panel members. But the fact is, political parties also can collect a subset of that. It's part of the general activity that you take on. So that again increases the threat. It's a really valuable target, even if you just look at cyber criminals, not necessarily a nation state to interfere. And so when you go through this, the political parties themselves, how do you address that? How do you find the ability to do it? Because it is expensive. IT does not necessarily come secure by default. You typically have to do something. Now that is changing in a lot of cases. There are organizations stepping in. But one of the things we've seen is consumers don't value security. Consumers value functionality. And and I'm not trying to put my friend here from Microsoft on the spot, but companies need to respond to what the dollar is valuing. And so if you're a big enough company, you put money in there. So I think you've got a few challenges here in terms of political parties. How do they respond? We're not talking about an organization with a deep IT security investment. Where does the government step in as a nonpartisan player? And can we have enough trust that an organization like my own could come in and give advice? But we still respond to ministers who are elected, and it is a partisan ministry. And then when you go into the media side of things, that's the other challenge we face. And it's the fact that the media dynamic has changed so much in the last decade, if not more than that. How do we prepare for that? How do we prepare citizens? But also how we consume news and how we consume media is just fundamentally different from even the election. The 2015 election, it's going to be very different in 2019, very different 2011. That is just compounding the challenge here, because we just haven't talked through it yet in terms of how you engage. What is the micro-targeting, the threats that can be brought by the technology itself? Because I actually don't think most of us actually understand that an algorithm is selecting what we see. And most people don't understand that they've actually shaped it in ways that they didn't know. And so all of these are just additively coming together and just saying, well, now how do we respond in a democratic way? So those are the challenges we face. I know it was a little not the question you asked, but...
Okay, so I'm going to pick up on a comment, if I can kind of use I'm not really chair, but moderator, so I'm going to pretend I'm chair's prerogative, and take something that you said, which is consumers don't value security. I think that's right, and I think it's not so much that they don't value security as an absolute, but when weighed against other things like service delivery, like responsiveness, they don't value it because of something. It's not that they don't value it, period. It's that there's a reason why. And so I wonder if I can ask the panel to comment on that, because I think it's a very powerful and true statement, and it's very, very much germane to what we're talking about. If I can ask panelists to comment on, do you think consumers value security? Do you think voters value security? And what's the relationship there? And because I think also there's a resistance to things like online voting, right? Like there's a particular fear of that, even though online voting in Canada, particularly when we're dealing with populations that exist in very remote areas, Canadians who are living with disabilities, we have a significant accessibility problem when it comes to elections. And I don't think any of us is in a position at this point where we can pretend that doesn't exist. Tell me why we're not going to have online voting, because people are afraid. So, that's a trade-off. And I'm just like, okay, how can we push this, right? Like, we got to push this conversation. How are we going to do that?
Can I nuance my statement just a touch? Because I think...
And let me nuance that I wasn't trying to pin that on you.
No, because actually, I think if consumers value security, they think it's somebody else's responsibility to deliver it for them. I think that's actually what I was trying to get at here. They don't want to pay for it. They want somebody else to take it on.
No, so just maybe building on that, I actually think that that's okay, right? I mean, I do think consumers, voters, people in our society absolutely value security, but like at most good cybersecurity panels, there's always the car analogy, right? And so it's sort of like, if I'm driving a car, I absolutely value having airbags. I do not want to have to understand how the airbag actually works, but I want to benefit from its effect, right? And so I think same for security. It's in many ways, and this is what I was trying to get at, not only why do we as a technology company care, but I think why industry needs to wake up, I think, to these questions, and to some degree has woken up when we think about sort of where we are on sort of the security journey when it comes to the internet broadly, but also specific products, security more and more is getting built in from the start, which did not used to be the case several decades ago, maybe not even several years ago, right? And the shift to modern technologies like cloud is the most evident example of actually being able to shift some of the security responsibilities from the endpoint onto the cloud provider that will do certain things for you in an automated way, right? And so I can just say, at Microsoft again, we spend, what is it? We're up to over $1 billion a year spent on cybersecurity, which is a pretty big number that I think it'd be tough to find other enterprises out there spending that much on security. Now, again, I will put that in context. We are seeing an active cyber arms race. You know, some of the threats we are most concerned about relate to nation states, and nation states are pouring billions of dollars into cyber offensive capabilities. And so, you know, we're spending a lot on defense. Others are spending a lot on offense. There's a very active cyber crime, of course, element out there, and oftentimes we're now seeing the professionalization of cyber crime, right? And sometimes even sort of a more hybrid form of 1 week, you know, I'm a cyber criminal operating for financial gain. The next week, I might be deputized by my government to go and do certain things. So that's really challenging as well. But I think, you know, coming back to the industry responsibility piece, you know, we believe there needs to be security built in from the ground up. There needs to be rigorous testing before you should be allowed to actually deploy a service or a product into the market, and consumers should not have to understand the details of these things to a certain point. Now, when you're an enterprise and you have sort of enterprise-grade security needs, there are sort of variations of that, because ultimately, you know, you might be running lots of other line of business applications on top of what we might provide, and you want to make sure that when you get an update rolled out, that it doesn't break your existing infrastructure, and so there's more nuance there. But from a broad sort of consumer and broad public perspective, I think it's fairly clear that these security features and services just simply need to be built in a way that can then be used in a much more consumable way.
Perhaps to kind of add on and just clarify one thing, the idea of people don't need to understand how airbags work, they just need to know that they're there and they like them. But they also like them because they know that they're gonna save their lives if they end up in a car accident.
Yeah.
And I think what's important there is we build out preferences through education, and the idea of airbags being a thing that might save my life is not something that people knew before airbags were necessarily in all cars. And so the idea of, you know, do voters value security? I think to a certain extent we only need a number of voters, a basic kind of get it over the hump number of voters to value security, and the rest don't have to value it yet. They need to be taught why they should value it. Once it's there and once security is part of the system that they've just come to expect, then there's a lot less of the, well, is this a worthwhile way to spend our resources? And so I think that plays along very well with what you're saying of building it from the ground up into all of these systems is absolutely crucial. But you need to also recognize that citizens need to understand why security is helpful to them for this to be palatable in an election, for a political party to run and say, we're going to make sure that things are secure. We're telling you what information we have and how we use it and how we're securing it, not so that you can attack us for having data at all, but so that you can understand that this is valuable. And I think we need to recognize that that's an important part of the education system of the citizenry.
I think voters absolutely care about privacy and they care about their data. They just probably aren't aware of how much data political parties, we're talking about them as a week, that actually have about them. So political parties have a statutory right to the names of electors in their district and their address. And they've always supplemented that with door-to-door canvassing, or people have heard of the robocalls scandal, right? Communicating with people by phone, obviously, was one way parties tried to get information. But now the parties have extremely sophisticated databases. The Conservative Party, no party wants to talk too much about their data game right now for obvious reasons, but the Conservatives used to talk about the Constituent Information Management System, I'm not picking on them. They were just actually the most sophisticated party in Canada at getting involved in the data game. The other parties all have similar systems. The ultimate end goal is to have a profile on every single voter in Canada based on information you willingly give political parties when you like, right, that it's the birthday of a politician, right, or there's some other milestone, fundraising data, door-to-door canvassing data, stuff they purchase based on your consumer habits, other things you do on social media. Facebook has a ton of information that's useful to parties, right? Especially as the revelation has come out that you may be followed as you leave Facebook and go to other sites. So there's a ton of information from online and offline that the parties have. And so the relevant legal fact is that parties are one of the only entities in Canada that are not covered by privacy legislation. So most public and private actors are covered by the Privacy Act or PIPEDA. PIPEDA, everyone pronounces it differently. Bill C-76 has some measures to close that gap, but all it does, I'm generally in favor of Bill C-76. I was at the committee on Monday saying mostly nice things about it. But on the privacy aspect, it doesn't nearly go far enough. It requires parties to have privacy policies, which they all already do, that address certain issues, so that's helpful. But there's no enforcement mechanism and there's no actual rights for voters. So you don't have a right to know what the party knows about you. You don't have a right to have it be destroyed. You don't have a right to be notified if there is a breach, right? So a political party might have been hacked by a foreign nation state and had data about all voters be disclosed to that nation state, and that is being held right now, and we would not know about it necessarily. And so there was a scandal, last point, there was a scandal by the standards of several years ago when it turned out people were getting emailed holiday greetings on a holiday that it wasn't actually their religion to practice, and the question was why. So how did the political party get this information, right? That's like a kindergarten scandal compared to what could happen today based on the amount of data that parties have and the vulnerabilities that many nonpartisan independent actors have identified are there, right? The threat that the parties aren't necessarily able to secure the data in the way that we might expect sophisticated private sector corporations to do.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so here's a question. What makes Canada an attractive target for foreign sources of cyber threat?
Finally, one in my wheelhouse. I think what we pointed out, there's a few things, right? We are a G7 nation, as we're about to see in the next few days. We are a wealthy country. We're a country that, we talked about, multicultural, welcoming, open, et cetera. Member of the Commonwealth, and I think we underestimate as Canadians. We tend to be fairly humble about ourselves, but I do think we play a role on the world stage. We also have a voice, and so all of those things kind of combine to attract interest, and not to forget that who our closest neighbor is, and who we have incredibly integrated both infrastructure but also relationships with, and that's the U.S. And so all of those things couple together to make us quite an attractive target, either for direct or for some place to try something out. We have, and we do have a certain amount of vulnerabilities, and in general, one of the things we've struggled with as we try to get the message out about cybersecurity, Canadians tend to believe, well, it won't happen to me. That's a general issue we've had in cybersecurity for a number of years, and so all of those combine to make us, frankly, an attractive target. In some cases, a very easy target, and that's something that we're trying to talk or explain to people, help educate, and I think these conversations are incredibly important because, frankly, that's what's going to make the difference. It's the education piece, it's the citizen awareness piece, and making better decisions. Not perfect decisions and not perfect security. It's always a balance. But knowing that when you're making an investment decision, you go to the version that's more secure, not the lowest cost always. And understanding that that's a factor that needs to be built in, you bring that in. So that's the threat environment. Frankly, we're attractive. We have a loud voice out there. We are a pretty decent economy in terms of we're not the biggest, but we're also a little bit of a middle power gateway, if you want to call it that.
So it's kind of Donald Trump's fault.
Well, no, I would.
No, I'm just kidding.
I mean, it's
I definitely didn't say
it's
that.
also worth kind of understanding that If you're not a fan of democracy, undermining any democracy can be spun into, look, democracy is terrible. It doesn't work for anyone. Even Canada can't keep their democracy strong, right? And so I think that point is really important, thinking about why certain foreign influence might be motivated in the first place. And then the other kind of side of that is chaos changes the balance of power internationally. And so if you don't like the amount of power you currently have in the global system, creating a chaotic system is going to help you potentially maneuver to a position where you have more power. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
I think that's exactly right. The only thing I'd add is Canada also passed its version of the Magnitsky Act, right, which sanctions for a nation state potentially that could be very well hostile to Canada. Maybe that was one of the motivating factors with regard to their involvement in the U.S. election. That's speculation, but that might play a role.
So we have an election coming up next year. We have a scheduled federal election in the fall of 2019. That's not that far away. What is being done and what still needs to be done to protect our system against those foreign but also domestic sources of cyber risk? And Jan, not to put you on the spot, but maybe you can draw on your observations of how US and European states are acting or not acting to keep their elections safe.
It's a great question. And I think, again, coming back to what we've witnessed in the last few years, clearly the topic of sort of election security and keeping democratic processes is much more top of mind for governments as it is for private sector entities, researchers, etc. And I'm not sure that any one country. So I just spent the last 4 years in being based in Brussels, leading Microsoft cybersecurity work for Europe, and I'm not sure that any one country in particular actually has necessarily figured all of that out. What I would say is sort of some high-level observations. I think would be that there clearly is a recognition that no government or no individual corporation can solve these challenges alone. So there clearly is a need for increased collaboration, specifically on these topics. We tend to hear a lot about, there's a need for more public-private partnership on cybersecurity, and with that comes the need for more information sharing. All of that is true, but I think we need to actually get much more granular, much more specific about how we share information. How we're able to work not only between public and private sector, but frankly also, for example, across private sector lines. I talked earlier in my sort of opening comments about these threats increasingly being of a more sort of a hybrid nature, right, where you have the information component and disinformation component, but also the sort of pure cyber elements. And so I think one of the things we're looking into is how we might actually increase collaboration between private sector companies on sharing threat intelligence and trying to get ahead of this game, because ultimately you could have an account on a social media platform, but you use an email account from another provider to actually open that. You tie that to 2 or 3 other things, and so there really is sort of a cross industry element that I think needs to become much more robust. We try to address some of that, taking some sort of early steps. Again, a couple of months ago in April, when we launched, we called with I think 40 other companies now, the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, where we committed to a set of principles that we believe those of us in industry that care about these issues should commit to, and one of those principles, which includes sort of not enabling any offensive activity and working on stronger defense, but also in particular trying to work more across competitive boundaries to collaborate on security. And I think that's a sort of another step in that regard. So that set of collaboration is important. There's probably quite a bit more that could be done also between governments, frankly. I really look forward to the G7 outcomes from this week, which we sort of saw the foreign minister's G7 statement from a few months ago had a very helpful, I think it was a couple of paragraphs maybe, on the topic of protecting democratic processes in there, where they called, among other things, for the establishment of, I think it was a sort of a rapid reaction mechanism where countries could collaborate much more effectively. I'd love to hear more about that. I think many of us in industry would be very open to helping contribute to such a mechanism. And so I think those are the types of kind of more hands-on concrete ideas that we need to advance in order to get ahead of this.
Any other panelists want to jump in, or?
Sure. I'll do it. So one of the players that we haven't talked much about yet is the news media industry and journalism. And I think that is really important in two different ways. One way is the whole disinformation front and trust in information, and how do you know what to consider reliable and what not to consider reliable. And the other is the more typical standard role that journalism has played in informing people about how campaigns are going and talking about the issues that are important. And journalism institutions are at risk of hacking just as political parties are. They're also at risk of being used in ways that were unintended. So an example is during the 2015 election, there was at least one third-party organization that selected particularly favorable headlines from existing media companies and chose to promote them, and so used their own money to advertise using that existing journalistic content, right? And journalists need to understand that that is a possibility, that the way they've put their content out there in the first place might not be the way it is then fed to people in different parts of society. And so there's pieces of the journalistic ecosystem that are shifting and that we need to make sure are understood. So there's some work to be done educating editors and journalists. There's also work to be done educating the population so that when we get to that election period, when there are cyber attacks that happen, hopefully there aren't, but if there are, we need people to be able to understand the various pieces that have created that system, right? So we need people to understand how an algorithm actually works, right? If an algorithm is being gamed to try and suppress the vote of particular individuals or groups of individuals, we need to have a shared language that we can use to explain how that's happening and why. Otherwise, we do lead into that kind of complete chaos and nobody can trust anything, and why bother voting, which is, you know, the exact point of those sorts of suppression tactics in the first place. And so I think some of the things that are being done, like fact checking, like trying to create more media literacy through reporting, these are really good steps, but we're not there yet. There's still a lot of people who don't understand the basics, and I don't mean kind of the uneducated citizenry, I mean like the people creating the content in the first place as well as that citizenry. And so I think that that's one of the important things among a variety of other things that political players need to do preparing for 2019.
We should probably talk about election administrators as well. We haven't done that as much. Elections
You're
candidates.
preempting my next
Oh,
question.
sorry. Well,
No,
why don't you ask it?
This is good. We're in sync. This is a very good sign for the panel.
At an existential level.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to ask the panel one more question, and then I'm going to allow, that's a terrible word. Let me take that one back. I am going to shut up and let microphones move through the room and have audience members pose questions to the panel. But for my last question, and building on Michael's theme, I'm going to ask you to pick one political player in Canada's broader democratic landscape. So Elections Canada, political parties, local campaigns, mainstream media, third parties, the public service, parliament, any other institution you can think of, and give your assessment of their cyber readiness for the next election. And what, if anything, you might want to see them do between now and then?
I guess I'll go ahead on election administration. Elections Canada is doing a security audit this summer, I believe. That was the testimony of the interim CEO. So that's important. I think they're well aware of the threats. The provincial election commissions don't necessarily have the same resources. There are some municipalities in Canada that vote online or that are run, their elections are run with very skeletal staffs, if you want to put it that way. So I think we should broaden our focus beyond just Elections Canada, which I think is doing a very good job, but to some of the other entities, because it's once you lose trust in the process, if say there's foreign interference in a provincial or municipal election, it's very hard to get it back. One area where I think they could all improve is, you know, the internet comes along, it's this wonderful new thing. You don't want to suppress political speech online by monitoring political expression, but it means even the laws need to be updated, and C-76 says some of that, but even the existing laws are not applied or enforced to the extent they should be online. There's some recent reports in the media today about groups not registering, third-party groups not registering and advertising in Ontario. So what are the capacities and willingness of election commissions to get involved in monitoring things happening online? So that's another aspect of it that's not specifically tied to security, but I think there's lots more that could be done.
So on Elections Canada, actually, we started working on the 2019 election with them before 2015 election was done. They're very much thinking ahead and looking ahead on how to do things. So I feel quite, plus, you know, paper ballots with hand-filled-in forms at some point that actually collate into a physical entity make it very easy. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not leveraging technology, but we've been working with them well in advance. But I think it actually goes back to some of the media points. Because at the end of the day now, the political parties have their infrastructure set up. We're getting to the point where the next election is here, to the point of it's a continuing campaign. And so there's an incentive, just like there is in the commercial space, to protect some of the private information that's there and to try to get on top of it. But I think on the media side, media has never been under as much pressure right now in terms of getting content out. I was talking to some reporters, and yes, we talked to reporters. But I was talking to some reporters, and some of them were saying they have 50 minutes between start of story to get something out so they can move on to the next thing, especially if they're, well, that's not a lot of time to go and verify, right? You kind of have to go with how can you get information, how can you're not talking about triple source, triple checking, and all the other things that not everybody's well funded for. And it's just a different dynamic. And so how do we as consumers of media, say, okay, does this really ring true? But frankly, who's the truth police? You can't have that. We're allowed to believe what we're allowed to believe. I think we're just facing so many media challenges. And I guess on social media, my question is, they've had an almost unfettered way of gaining profits from the private data we've seeded. Why can't I know, why am I seeing this? Why can't I click on something that says something as simple as, why did I see this? And it tells me. There's some questions there that there's a responsibility of these organizations as they've taken more and more role. Is there a moral responsibility that they need to start taking on as well?
So I would just say that I think as we look at sort of the entire supply chain, you could almost call it, of the electoral processes, all of the different pieces are important, right? It'd be hard for me to kind of pick, you're asked to pick one. I'll say our ambition certainly is to work with all the different stakeholders in that supply chain and in that process. And I think there are things that we can bring to bear from a technology perspective, whether it is working with political parties, whether it is working with election authorities. Actually, we've been doing some of that in the past, and we're going to certainly intensify that, because one of the things we're finding is that there is a huge challenge in terms of some of these systems being just so outdated that we need to just really work with them to try and get that updated. There are many other elements there as well. Now, we're not a large social media platform, so I can't maybe speak as well to some of those issues. That said, I think we want to use our voice to try and move our industry forward together in a responsible manner, and I think there are different ways of how we can do that. I mentioned the Tech Accord. Both Facebook and Microsoft are members of this. This was an initiative that we sort of shepherded. 38 other companies are members of this, and we want to look for opportunities to actually try and really move the needle forward on this, because ultimately, not only is it the right thing to do, but I think we all benefit, frankly, from the resilience of our democratic societies, and so we want to play our part.
It's worth noting that for advertisements, many of the big social media companies now are creating the click here, why am I seeing this? Doesn't help for things that come through your feed. It's organically is what it's called. So your friends or followers, or depending on what platform you're on, whatever, they people get to be called, what they've been posting or sharing or liking, right? But it's usually pretty high level information. It doesn't give you a lot of detail. And I would say that in the context of an election, we probably want to go farther than a person has to click through a bunch of pages to find that information. We need it to be front and center. Every single advertisement that you get through radio or television has to have very obviously, this is paid for by this person or this campaign, right? And the new election law that's being talked about right now does say that that is going to be required, but it's a bit unclear how exactly the platform companies are going to have to embed that into their technological design. And so there's a few questions there about whether or not people will actually see it. Because while you can guarantee on radio by saying it out loud, people are going to hear it, you can't guarantee that it's necessarily going to be seen or understood depending on how the interface is designed for each of those different posts across social media. And this, I think, connects in with the sort of last political player maybe that we need to talk about here, which is those third parties, those groups that are participating in trying to shift opinions, but aren't running candidates themselves, right? So unions are often third parties. There's also civil society organizations, get out the vote organizations that are trying to engage people in the electoral process. These are groups that don't usually get the same kind of tech support offered by platforms that official political parties do, right? So if you're part of one of the major political parties, something's gone wrong on your Facebook, you have a contact at Facebook that you can go and talk to. This is a put a Band-Aid on this problem kind of solution because it doesn't prevent the problems in the first place, which ideally we'd be able to do with cyber threats. But if you're one of these smaller third parties, you don't get that personal line to people at Facebook or at these other companies. And as third parties become more important and more influential, as Mike's already talked about, the risk for them becomes greater, but the political platform or the platforms don't have political incentive necessarily to help them out the way they do to help out whoever might be in charge of figuring out whether or not they should be regulated after the election.
Thank you. So I think at this point we're going to invite members of the audience to ask questions to the panelists. And we have microphones that are available this way and that way. And if you can wave a hand so that we can see you.
That's great. Is that on?
Yep.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, guys. This has been really great. I had one quick comment and then two kind of hopefully quick questions. The first thing, just based on my experience, I'm a recovering partisan. And one of the things I've kind of been thinking about lately is we've never had secure political data from a Canadian standpoint. So canvassing is perhaps the biggest source of political data. That's heavily reliant on volunteers with pieces of paper on clipboards. It's still the case, even though we have tablet technology, cloud technology. A lot of it's still done on paper. And that information tells a lot about you. It says when you're home, when you're not home. It says if you have a pet, if you have an angry dog. It says, are you going to vote for us? Do you think you're going to vote for us? Are you against us? What issues you care about? It's pretty sensitive data. And it hasn't been secure from the start. I know that we have digital tools to complement that. Political parties really, I don't think, have a capacity to address these issues. So my first question is really talking about capacity. With political parties being able to address these issues properly, and then also with Elections Canada. A lot of these digital tools that we have, from Nation Builder to Facebook and Twitter advertising, the rules are changing, the algorithms are changing all the time, and there's new techniques. And Elections Canada kind of tries to figure out how to react to those new developments on the fly, and we don't actually have rules that are concrete and kind of explain things and cover how those changes evolve over time. So I guess my question is, from a capacity issue, where do we need to improve to see political parties and Elections Canada actually really close this gap in their capacity to actually get some clarity on these issues? And my second question is just about political parties and how they share data provincially, because there are quite a few political parties that share even their databases with their provincial counterparts. The NDP is a great example of this, where their populace account is being used both by the NDP and in the Ontario election currently. So from a federalism standpoint, how do we address the data issue there? Thanks.
Thank you very much for your question.
Well, PIPEDA being applied to political parties would help solve some of the issues about sharing data across different campaigns. And in terms of the capacity to address security issues, you're right. Political parties have been collecting data on clipboards for a long time, and even when they're using apps, usually in a campaign room, there is a gigantic wall with aggregate data that's being updated constantly, right? And anybody can walk in and out of that room. And that kind of access is important for a campaign because that's how you build a community of volunteers who are really excited to help. You make them feel part of the process. You don't make them feel locked off from the very core of the people who are going to go vote for the candidate I'm excited about, right? There's a really important social component to why it's created like that, beyond just the idea of, do we have the resources to make it secure or not, right? You create a system potentially where people don't get to feel as part of the campaign as they would have before. And so if a solution's going to come in that makes it more secure, there's knock-on solutions that need to come up for how to maintain connection and how to maintain the ability to diffuse the door knocking across a whole bunch of people that often walk in off the street, right? And so I don't know that there's necessarily a good solution for that, but something like moving towards a system where you are using tablets, so you're punching in the information into a system that has been checked to be secure, and there's the appropriate measures because it's been built in from the bottom up at the design level and all the way through, that could help solve some of these problems, I think, but obviously takes time to implement and is clearly not a viable option for the very small parties.
So I maybe just, I agree with that, and we'll just add to that couple of points. One, and this is probably true for most questions about cybersecurity. I would say 80% of questions can be answered with, it really is about people, it's about policy, and it's about technology. And I think we need all three of those to kind of come together, right? I think there's a training element that needs to happen when it comes to helping parties keep themselves secure. There's a policy element. I think that's the privacy discussion. To what extent should those rules cover groups like political parties? And then there's a technology component, really, and that really goes back to making sure that some of this data, to the extent that it is allowed, actually lives in an environment that is technologically secure. And then we get back into kind of what we talked about earlier, and I think we're probably at the beginning of sort of a technological evolution in that particular sort of civic tech space, and I think it's critical when we think about from the perspective of what data is being held, as you described, that it does seem critical to us at least that there is a very robust need for more modern technologies that can actually assist with securing that data. On a sort of a larger point, though, being I think we are entering also with regard to privacy, we're clearly entering a bit of a new age in the sense that we just a few days ago had GDPR sort of fully come into effect. We have, from a Microsoft perspective, been very supportive of that. We actually think that for the most part will be the privacy law for large parts of the world. Now Canada has very robust privacy legislation to begin with, but many other countries don't or didn't. And so as companies that do business in Europe, we are going to be fully compliant with GDPR, and so customers elsewhere will actually benefit from that as well. And I think that's true for many other technology providers as well.
Yes, please.
Self-interest can be a wonderfully motivating thing. I think any political party that doesn't take security and cybersecurity seriously might not exist in 10 years, right? Because we've all identified them as weak points, and I think the parties get that. So if it's a matter of resources, parties get resources from the state in all sorts of different ways already. And so there's no barrier in the abstract to them getting resources that have to do with cybersecurity. You get reimbursement for your personal expenses as a candidate, right? You get reimbursement for what the campaign is. So why not some kind of reimbursement for cybersecurity expenses, for example? That would be one practical way to deal with it.
Thank you. My name is Jeffrey Dale. I have two questions. One's a quick question on privacy, and one's then on cybersecurity. On the privacy one, Michael, this is probably just a quick question for you. Is the new GDPR, does it also exempt political parties in Europe?
Good question. I think they're captured. Jan might know better than I do. I think they are captured under it.
Yeah, I believe so as well, but
Right. Okay, so I mean, they're finally updating. I mean, we haven't updated Pepita since social media was even started, so it's interesting to see where we go next with our own GDPR type of implementation. On the cybersecurity one, you've all talked about cybersecurity defense, on how corporations and governments look at defending ourselves on cyber attacks. But we're also hearing about that the Canadian government's looking at allowing organizations to get offensive, like they can actually be active in terms of going after cybersecurity. And you hear in the media that that's not a good thing. Like you hear like worries about what could happen. I don't know what those are. So can you give us examples of what would be an active cyber action from a government like Canada that would be viewed as being having a positive outcome, and then one that would have an action that could potentially have a negative outcome? Because I just don't understand what the difference, why it's viewed as negative if we actively go after somebody that's attacking us.
Okay.
I'll let you go first, but I'm happy to chime in.
So I think when you look at this, one of the key things for us is that, because it's Bill C-59 that you're talking about, and it's the CSE Act that codifies two concepts. One is defensive cyber operations, so the ability to take action online to protect yourself, and then active cyber operations. So in the defensive sphere, this is something that we've said, this is not a tool that you deploy every single day. It's a tool that you put in your toolbox for when you need it. And the time to debate the use for it is when you don't need it. And so there's a few examples that we have. So for example, when information is stolen, when some information is taken from you, this might be the way to get it back. This might be the way to protect it, to render it useless to the person who's stolen it, type of thing. That's an example of something that you could do. When somebody is deploying nation-state level capabilities and is just exceeding the capacity of commercial level defenses, that might be a time where you do that to protect critical infrastructure. But it would have to be something that's very well considered, and that's why not only when you talk about the authority, you have to talk about the accountability around that. Not all nations follow this same approach, but for example, for us, it's not just there's both review in place that's proposed as part of this. So the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency is the new proposed review agency, but also then you've got the Minister of Foreign Affairs having a say, and the Minister of National Defense before those go in. That's over and above all the other accountability mechanisms that are in place. So I think when you look at those authorities, you have to look at the structure that goes around it. Because the fact is, I think sometimes that might be it might be the tool of last resort. Now, I understand that when you look at these, people think cyber attack, and they watch the movies and they go to the movie examples. The point there is, we're still Canada. We still have a government that's accountable. We still have review in place that goes and that places limits around these things as well. This is not a free pass to go and do whatever you want on the internet. This is still accountable government, is still in very measured circumstances with very clear triggers. So that's from that perspective, from our perspective. It is really about filling in with authorities, what frankly most other nations in the world have today, so that Canada isn't falling behind and isn't the easier target.
So yeah, let me just add to that. From our perspective at least, when we think about what nation-state investments in offensive cyber actions mean, we are concerned about the trends that we're seeing, and this used to be a set of capabilities that was probably limited to maybe a handful of countries in the world. Last time I checked, when you look at some NGO reports, even the UN has some numbers out. We're now looking at somewhere like 30 to 35 countries in the world that have offensive cyber capabilities declared. And so, there is clearly sort of this is a trend where governments don't always, and these are usually not your responsible governments, right, from sort of a global geopolitical perspective, use this as a tool of last resort, but oftentimes as a sort of something that they do. I don't want to say gratuitously, but they do use it much more frequently. And the challenge comes not necessarily when we're talking about sort of targeted espionage or military. The challenge is, this is sort of a shared and integrated domain, right? The risk for escalation and the risk for unintended consequences is huge. And so, we've seen this in operations like Stuxnet a few years ago, right? Which was a very sophisticated operation, presumably executed by 2 Western governments. Nobody knows for sure. Well, some people probably know for sure. I don't. But it is something that, exploited at the time 4 zero-day vulnerabilities in Windows, right? And so we essentially had to end up defending over 1 billion customers in a response to what ultimately was meant to be a highly targeted, highly precise government operation against another nation state's infrastructure that ultimately sort of got out of hand and spread and affected over 1 million systems around the world. And so, I think this is kind of the concern that we have. And in response to that, again, there are many, many things that I think we in industry need to do, including certainly building security and right from the ground. But there also is an element where governments need to be held accountable for these activities when they do target civilians in particular and have these sort of mass consequences outside of kind of your much more narrowly defined military to military interaction. And one of the things we've been calling for some time now is this notion of a digital Geneva Convention that would actually enshrine some of the principles for governments to declare what they would believe is inbounds and what's out of bounds with regards to cyber offensive operations. And there's lots of debate about it, whether that's the right title or framing for it, but ultimately I think there's a lot of agreement and increasing agreement that we need clear rules of the road for what that needs to look like.
Just a real quick one. Women, we're like 1 in 3 in the room, but that happens a lot at these kinds of things. We also statistically tend to like to take a little longer to think before we ask questions. So if there are women who have any questions, I encourage you to raise your hand.
It's not exactly cybersecurity, perhaps. I'm talking about the Phoenix payroll system. To some extent, just simply in the terms of the amount of money that it has cost Canada, it's almost an attack on our. And I think Microsoft was the provider of that system, or an American firm. No, it was not Microsoft. IBM, pardon me.
Sorry.
Pardon me. I'm out of my depth.
I hadn't heard about that one.
So, no.
Okay.
Just perhaps even you can answer for IBM rather than. Yeah, well, I mean, how could that possibly have happened in this sophisticated, technological? How could we have made such mistakes that still are far from being solved? And again, I apologize. Microsoft, IBM means nothing to me.
I honestly don't have the sort of details of that specific incident, but if it was related to IBM, then that's probably the right folks to raise that with. Sorry. But maybe others on the panel have
I have a question about democratic decision-making around technological issues. So technology increasingly is becoming part of elections. In Ontario, at the municipal level, individual councils decide what kind of voting systems they will use. Provincially, it's the provincial government. Federally, it's the federal government. Many hundreds of municipalities for the upcoming municipal election have chosen online voting. Provincially, they've chosen computer vote counting. Federally, it's still all paper. What can we do legally, technologically, to help the democratic system make decisions about complex technical issues? I know the panel has talked about some gaps in understanding about even algorithms. computer security is maybe even a more complex issue. How can we help the whole political system make better decisions about technology and elections, or technology in general?
Maybe I can start. One of the things we did after we issued the threat report was actually to go out and talk to provincial electoral officers to at least brief them on the threat, so they were to increase the awareness and start to spread some of that information. And I think one of the key things was that threat report we put out, there is not a classified version of it that's held within the federal government. We put everything we could into making sure that we were being as open as we possibly could. That will be updated and followed up on, et cetera. But you've hit on a really critical point. It's because it's ironic. My dad ran the municipal election in Regina at one point, and zero resources, right? It was, hey, you're this manager over here, you're running the election today, and then you go back to your job tomorrow. And so I think that's where we have to start breaking down some of the barriers between the jurisdictions and start to work on this. But at the end of the day, no municipality is going to be able to build a custom online voting application. Maybe Toronto, which is pretty big, but they have to be pretty large to have the IT investment to be able to do it. So you're going to need to lean on technical providers, not necessarily Microsoft, not that I'm trying to, I'm not a salesman. But the fact is that some of these bigger companies that are starting to deal with this at scale I think that's something that you have to look at, and how do you deal with it?
Yeah, maybe just it's really interesting. I think so much of the technological choices that go into this, of course, are contextual, right, and dependent on your broader sort of environment and ecosystem. I just spent a week last week in Estonia, which is always sort of touted as Europe's most digital country, and everybody has a digital ID or electronic ID, which is the basis for their online voting. And in Estonia, they have, I think, probably the world's highest percentage of online voting. About every election, about 30 to 33% of citizens use internet voting. Something that is unimaginable in the country that I grew up in, which is Germany. Certainly, you don't see it in the U.S. Not entirely sure about other places, but it is. You have these sort of, but again, they have put in place an infrastructure in large parts dependent on sort of robust electronic ID form that allows you to identify and verify voters, and they've put some security systems in place that help them do this, and they have lots of redundancy. Of course, there's sort of a redundancy that is focused on paper. You can always switch your online vote to a paper vote, and also they're working with a scale that is much more manageable, 1.3 million citizens. So it is, but it is certainly a very interesting approach, and I think. From at least talking to them, there seems to be lots of interest by other countries who've come to visit and learn from them to kind of see what might work in other contexts. So stay tuned.
But actually, there was a really key point in there, and that was digital identity. And every time Canada's tried to have that debate, it's gotten shouted down extremely quickly because it starts to look like a national identity number or a national barcode. And so there isn't that debate. And so without some of those basic tools, it's very hard to be able to identify who you are when you're going to vote. And you've got to have that debate. And so maybe that's a future public policy forum discussion.
There's a hand over there.
Hand over here.
Hello.
Hi.
Given some of the statements earlier about how one country alone can't tackle this threat, and I think that holds true to basically all security issues. I'm curious to know, sorry, Scott, why Canada isn't part, in any part really, other than a one-time small donation. Why aren't they part of the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence?
So why Canada's not part of I'm not sure we're not. But that's something that we're always looking for partners. At the same time, NATO's a pretty complicated institution. I've got a lot of people who spend a lot of time dealing with NATO forums to discuss various things that are a lot of discussions. And so I think, right, it's really been where do we prioritize our resources? Now, doesn't mean that doesn't change going forward. I think we're also looking at who else can you work with in terms of, so you heard the discussion about the G7, the rapid response mechanism that Global Affairs will be leading, of course, but also then how do we start to look at broadening the international appeal beyond a traditional maybe military alliance, right? Now we're talking something a little bit broader than that, and maybe outside of the traditional ally space. There are more democracies than in NATO, so I think we've got to look at the different partnerships. Certainly, as we embark on the stand-up of the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, that's one of the key things is how do you leverage those international partnerships? And that's not only with nation states, it's also with industry, right? Global players are industry. And that could also mean NATO as well. But right now, it's just been a matter of where do we focus our limited resources for the bang for the buck.
I just want to make a plug for CCD COE because I think they do great work. And this is the NATO Cyber Center based in Tallinn. And having worked to some extent with that group and seeing what they're able to do in terms of tabletop exercises and other things, I think is incredibly useful. So the more partners, the better. Yeah, no, I think it's a really important outfit.
Yes, please. Hi.
Can you hear me? Okay,
Yes.
perfect. Thank you. It's a really interesting panel. Elizabeth, this is actually a question for you, something you mentioned. You brought up like the way that social media kind of systematically excludes, and then the challenge with the upcoming election, like get out the vote campaigns, and the fact that these fears and these tensions about like algorithms and bots and what's true, what's not, and all of that kind of thing. So I wanted to know your sort of opinion about like how and whose responsibility it is to educate about how these algorithms actually work. How do we increase this media literacy? And also like the demographic question about who's going to be voting, how they engage with social media, and yeah, whose primarily responsibility is it? Because your point today made me think about what a huge threat and concern this is for the next election. I hadn't been thinking about that before. So yeah, if you could just talk to that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it's an important one because identifying a problem is only useful if you can then identify groups that can help solve it. And I think this one is one where we can't say this is clearly and neatly in the jurisdiction of only one group, one set of political players. I think that when it comes to things about voting and making sure that things like where your polling place is and who the candidates are in your election or in your riding for this election, those sorts of things are very clearly important for Elections Canada to be communicating. And insofar as that message can't get across because of the way an algorithm is designed or the way some group is trying to manipulate what an algorithm is doing, that becomes important for Elections Canada to be able to talk about too. Then there's pieces that are the responsibility of journalists. I think that journalism plays a really, really important role, even as we see kind of the decline of news media industries. It's still the place that most people go to get information about politics when they need information about politics, right? Even though they're not willing to pay for it all of the time, it's still the trusted source, even in the context of disinformation and the kind of fears that have been happening. So I think that the journalism industry has a really, really crucial role to play. Then in the kind of longer term planning of this, are embedded in our education system needs to be not only this idea of media literacy, meaning knowing how to evaluate what's trustworthy and what isn't, how to evaluate when there's bias or there isn't, and what that means, but also things like data literacy and algorithmic literacy that help you understand the technologies that are being used to distribute and share and craft in some contexts this information. And I think things like civics classes. I grew up in Nova Scotia, so we didn't have civics class. That was kind of embedded in our social science class and our history class, whatever it is, depending on where you are. Those kinds of things are really important. And there we need to do teacher training. So there's an organization called Civics that's based in Toronto. They do really interesting work, and they've started a media literacy program to do just this. And so looking at what they're doing, it kind of being a first mover in this space in Canada, I think is a good step, but we can't say, oh, civics is doing it, good to go. Elections Canada doesn't need to do anything. Journalists don't need to do anything. Platforms don't need to do anything because civics has got it. because they don't. They're one player in a system, and we need to have this be a multi-pronged approach if we're going to equip citizens with the tools they need to understand the information that's coming across their screens.
Fantastic. Okay, we've 2 more questions.
Hello. Thanks
Hi.
for the discussion tonight. It's been interesting. My name's Trevor. I'm a PhD student at Ottawa U, and I'm studying what you can predict from people based on their digital footprint data. And so I want to ask a question about micro-targeting. One of the practices that's on the rise, it was in the 2015 Canadian election and the most recent US election, was inferring private traits about voters from existing digital footprint data. For example, personality in the Cambridge Analytica / Facebook scandal. And I'm wondering how this practice, and then using these private traits to target political ads. So for example, if you can figure out who has high personality trait neuroticism, you might find a population for your ads about security, things like that. It's been put into play. So in light of these rising practices, and often by political parties that are employing firms, I'm just wondering what your thoughts about predicting private traits are. Is this a threat to democratic practices? How does this interact with our privacy laws, for example? Is a political party that predicts something not disclosed by a voter a violation of our privacy laws, or is that okay? And how does it fit into this Elections Act amendment, or does it not at all? And the other opinion I've heard is that it's just the price of governance at this point. So I'd love to hear your opinions on this topic. Thank you.
All right, well, I'll do, first of all, the proud professor plug of Trevor and Julia, who's beside him. Just wrote a really interesting piece for Policy Options about this kind of an issue, talking about the fact that we haven't really had this discussion. And I think it's in part motivated by the fact that in the discussions we're having right now about how to update our election laws, we're not really dealing with this head on. This is not a thing that's been clearly addressed, and it's not something that I think we necessarily know how to address specifically, right? Because it, to use the word of the night, points to a bit of an existential problem, and that is, whether or not we think that a strong democracy requires citizens to be targeted based on policy issues and rational decision making, or is it about pulling people in to give an opinion at any cost, right? Like, we don't necessarily have a specific set of rules for how good democracy works when it comes to how you engage citizens. We just have the basic idea of citizens need to be engaged and informed enough to go cast their ballot. And so it makes it a tricky problem to address. Added to that is the idea that we're really fine with other data users, companies, for example, targeting us with advertisement based on what they think we're going to like. We have gotten very used to that. We even enjoy it because then we don't get terrible ads, right? And because we're okay with that in that part of our life, there is that argument of, well, why shouldn't it be different why should it be different in our political realm? And I'm not going to give my personal opinion on that right now.
I don't know the answer to the question. I do think the one thing we don't want to do is stop political parties from communicating with voters. And so if the predictive technology is as good as, say, Cambridge Analytica said it was, right? All it was doing is helping the party deliver what the voter wanted. Mm-hmm. So if we can prove this is somehow exploitative, right? Then maybe it's a different issue. But parties figuring out what voters want just in a more sophisticated way than the same ad for everybody who watches Hockey Night in Canada, that doesn't necessarily bother me. But we have to keep consent in mind. Part of the issue is people just don't know this is happening. They don't understand why they're being targeted. They don't know that they are being targeted, right? I don't think people get that other people aren't seeing the same ad necessarily. So one of the things we haven't talked about too much tonight, we danced a little bit around it, is algorithmic transparency, right? What's in the algorithm? How are they targeting you? Or transparency on right which third party is sending you the ad, but which search terms they use to find you, right? And if it's they're finding racists in the Ottawa area, that seems like a public policy problem, right? Right? But there's evidence that happened in the U.S. election, right? So, so on the far edges, I think there are problems, but I don't want to stop parties from communicating with voters and giving them what it is that they want in public policy terms.
We have one more question. Yes, I think I could.
Does this work?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So great discussion. Thank you. My question is pretty simple and short. So essentially, we've talked about a whole range of issues here, and loosely speaking, I think of them as threats or obstacles to democracy, democracy, right? And it ranges from cyber attacks to something like existing election laws. It's just such a wide breadth of issues here. Is there some general consensus on what are the most critical issues, what we need to tackle first? You can't deal with everything all at once. And who's that single body, and is there one, that can actually sit back and say, here are the various related issues. We need to sort of map out who's going to handle what and in what order. Is there anything of that sort?
So very briefly, maybe two things from my end. I'll make a plug for two reports that we've come across in our work and found really helpful in terms of taxonomy. One is a report by the New America Foundation that came out not too long ago that basically sort of broke it down as there's the manipulation of votes, there's the manipulation of voters, and then there's the broader sort of sowing discord and confusion in different ways. And so I think that's a really interesting report when you look at it and they break that down further, and then they have policy recommendations for how to address these three buckets. The other one really is to make a plug for the CSE report from last year, which I thought was actually really foundational and very insightful. So I thought that really contributed to the debate.
That's actually a really hard question because this really is one of those. I'm not using the word existential, but fundamental. It's just fun. You're talking about the foundation of how this has kind of worked for the first, let's say, 142 years of Confederation. Maybe not. Maybe 138, depending on how far back you go, where you think this trend started adapting things. Where we just have to start looking at. I think we're just going to have to start peeling these things off one at a time. What are the things we're most worried about? And if we're most worried about micro-targeting as a way of fracturing us as a citizenry, that's a different threat than if we're worried about the morality of using that same information to then target us and exploit our vulnerabilities. Because I think it's very different using the ability to target us with the information we want as voters. And that was a really good point that I just wanted to re-echo, because frankly, that helps me as a voter. Right? These are the issues I'm concerned with. Feed me the information, irregardless of the party behind it, versus the morality of exploiting my vulnerabilities as a human to then use that to drive me in a certain way. And I think that's where I don't know that there's we've established our moral compass on a lot of these things. And that's where I think the debate's going to really go, and it's going to be very broad across very many different aspects of social society. It certainly will keep a lot of academic research going for a number of years. That's a good thing, by the way. Like I actually think this is something we really need to talk about, not just for jobs.
Okay. If I can just jump in on your question, just as a kind of a wrap up. I would think that the security and the integrity of elections is first and foremost, because when that bottom falls out, then everything else is sort of in question. I think at the same time, what we've talked about in terms of voter education and awareness is incredibly important, because when we're talking about things like fake news and I think we're at a point where we have the technology, right? A lot of this stuff is because we have the technology to do it, right? And we have the technology to pump a bunch of stuff out there, even whether it's true or not, right? And then it creates a sense of truth because we hear it so much. And so if we're going to have that, and we can't slow technology really, we're going to have to fortify ourselves to be able to deal with that and be able to do our own verification, and that comes with the types of things we've been talking about in terms of education and awareness. I also think with respect to the micro-targeting, it's problematic for a couple of reasons. One is that I agree it's responsive, and that might be a good thing in some ways. problematic in the sense that if we're not all getting the same message, verification across the population is much more difficult. If messages are targeted to specific small sectors, you don't get that sort of cross, you don't get everybody viewing the thing at the same time. It's harder to be able to have someone to say, okay, that's not really true, right? Because it's only going out to small sectors and it's only going out for a short time and then it's gone, it's replaced by another message. So we're losing something there in the education and awareness and true news as opposed to fake news. And I think also if we're seeing parties that are breaking us down into little groups that they know things about us and they're shooting messages at us based on what they know about us, the ethics of that one way or the other, where is the leadership coming from? Where are political parties performing a nation building function where they're saying this is what we believe in, this is what we want to see for the country, now come to us because it's a good idea. Parties have always performed a nation building function in Canada, and I think it's problematic to the extent that they're stepping away from that because they can. Because it's faster, because they're responsive, and because the individual is like, yeah, this is good. The party knows me. You're saying what I want to hear. No, it's Susan Delacour shopping for votes is true. Anyway, that's depressing. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for everybody for coming, and thank you to the panelists for sharing your expertise with us and for broadening the scope of our awareness. Thank you so much to the Public Policy Forum and to Catherine Feenan for organizing a fantastic event for everybody. Thank you. Thank you so much.